June 7, 1943. The small village of Saint-Étienne-du-Bois in eastern France sat nestled between rolling hills, its church steeple piercing the morning mist as dawn broke over the occupied countryside. Marie Beaumont, 23 years old, with hair like spun gold that cascaded down to the middle of her back, believed she had been careful enough to keep her forbidden romance hidden from prying eyes. She expected to meet her love one final time before he fled to Switzerland. She had no idea that in less than 6 hours she would stand in the village square, surrounded by neighbors she had known her entire life, as they watched her punishment for loving the wrong man. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a brutal act of public humiliation during the darkest days of occupation would transform into an unexpected reunion that would change not only 2 lives, but an entire community's understanding of courage, loyalty, and the enduring power of love across the dividing lines of conflict. The occupation had changed everything in Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. For the villagers, life had narrowed to a series of careful calculations: how to stretch ration cards until the next distribution, which German officers were reasonable and which were not, and most importantly, which neighbors could still be trusted. Marie worked at the village bakery, which afforded her a slightly privileged position. The German commandant, Major Wilhelm Brandt, had requisitioned the bakery to provide bread for his officers stationed in the village. While most villagers subsisted on increasingly meager rations, Marie could occasionally smuggle home small amounts of flour or a half loaf of bread for her widowed mother and younger sister, Simone. What no one in the village knew, not even Simone or her mother, was that for the past 8 months, Marie had been secretly meeting David Rosenberg, a Jewish medical student from Lyon whose family had gone into hiding after the deportations began. David had been separated from his parents during their attempted escape to Switzerland and had found temporary shelter in an abandoned hunting cabin in the woods outside Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. Marie had discovered him there one autumn afternoon while foraging for mushrooms, nearly dead from pneumonia and starvation. Colonel Hans Meller of the 44th Logistics Division reviewed the production reports from the Saint-Étienne-du-Bois sector with mounting frustration. The area was falling 16% below its required food requisition quotas, and Berlin was demanding explanations. His superiors had made it clear that failure would not be tolerated, especially as preparations for reinforcing the Atlantic Wall required ever greater resources. The colonel's driver, Private Ernst Lehmann, 20 years old and still bearing a farmer's complexion despite 2 years in uniform, steered their Mercedes staff car along the winding country road towards Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. Unlike many of his comrades, Lehmann had developed an uncomfortable awareness of the fear in the eyes of the French villagers they encountered. Coming from a small farming community in Bavaria himself, he recognized in these people the same pride and connection to the land that his own family possessed. Marie slipped out of the bakery during her midday break, a small package of bread concealed beneath her shawl. The village streets were unusually quiet, with most people staying indoors whenever possible to avoid encounters with the occupation forces. She made her way to the edge of town, then followed the narrow path that led into the forest. The June sun filtered through the canopy of leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. She had made this journey dozens of times since the previous autumn, each time with the same fluttering mixture of fear and anticipation in her chest. The hunting cabin appeared much as it had for decades, weathered grey timber blending with the surrounding forest. Only someone who knew what to look for would notice the subtle signs of habitation, the carefully obscured smoke from the small chimney, the nearly invisible path worn through the underbrush. Marie knocked on the door in their established pattern. 2 quick taps, pause, 3 more. David opened the door, his face lighting up at the sight of her. Despite months of hiding, he maintained a dignity that Marie found remarkable. His dark curls were longer now, his face thinner, but his eyes still held the intensity that had first drawn her to him, a combination of intelligence and kindness that seemed to see directly into her soul. He pulled her inside quickly, ever vigilant. Their time together was always shadowed by danger, but that had only intensified their connection. Every moment was precious when each meeting could be their last. Marie handed him the package. Their fingers brushed momentarily, a small intimacy that sent warmth through her despite the circumstances. She watched as he carefully unwrapped the cloth to reveal the bread, along with a small chunk of cheese and half an onion she had managed to acquire. David's journal entry for that day, later recovered by Allied intelligence officers, recorded, "June 7th. Marie came again today. Sometimes I think her visits are the only thing keeping me alive. Not just the food she brings, but the reminder that humanity exists outside these walls. We talked about Lyon, about the university, about the life we might have in peace. I showed her my medical textbook, the only possession I managed to keep with me. She asked me to teach her about the human heart. How could I explain that she has taught me more about the heart than any textbook ever could?" As they sat in the cabin, Marie spoke in hushed tones. The village had been buzzing with rumors of increased German patrols in the area. There had been arrests in neighboring communities, people suspected of harboring Jews or aiding the resistance. David took her hands in his. They had been discussing for weeks his need to continue his journey to Switzerland. The Swiss border was less than 100 kilometers away, but it might as well have been 1,000 given the checkpoints, patrols, and the network of informants that had sprung up throughout the region. Marie had connections through the bakery. A distant cousin of the owner was involved with a group that had successfully guided several families across the border. It had taken weeks of careful conversations and veiled references, but she had finally arranged passage. David would leave the following night. What neither of them knew as they said what they believed would be their final goodbye was that they had been betrayed 3 days earlier. Jeanne Moreau, the butcher's wife who lived across the street from the bakery, had noticed Marie's regular disappearances into the forest, driven by some combination of jealousy, suspicion, and the promise of extra rations for information. She had reported her observations to Lieutenant Klaus Wagner, the German officer responsible for security in the area. That same morning, Wagner had ordered Private Lehmann and 2 other soldiers to follow Marie discreetly and report back on her destination. Lehmann had tracked her to the cabin, but, seeing the tender exchange through the window, had hesitated. Something about the scene, perhaps the way the young woman gently touched the man's face or the obvious care with which they spoke to each other, had stirred something in him. He found himself thinking of Elise, the neighbor's daughter he had courted before the war. Would she wait for him? Would anyone look at him with such tenderness when this was all over? His moment of hesitation cost him dearly. His companions, Corporals Schmidt and Hoffmann, had no such qualms. They reported directly to Lieutenant Wagner, who immediately ordered a raid on the cabin for later that afternoon when he could personally supervise the arrest. Marie left the cabin at 13:30, promising to return one last time the next evening to bring provisions for David's journey. She walked back toward the village, her mind occupied with the details of their plan, unaware of the German patrol that would soon descend upon the forest. In the village square, life continued with the strained normality that had become standard under occupation. Elderly men played boules under the watchful eye of a bored German sentry. Children played quieter games than before the war, instinctively understanding the need for caution. Women queued at the ration distribution point, exchanging whispered news and warnings. Marie returned to the bakery, slipping back in through the rear entrance. The owner, Monsieur Dupont, 64 years old and stooped from decades in front of the ovens, gave her a questioning look but said nothing. He had his suspicions about Marie's midday absences, but chose not to inquire. Information was dangerous currency in occupied France, and Monsieur Dupont had survived this long by minding his own business. At 1600 hours, Lieutenant Wagner led a squad of 6 soldiers into the forest. Among them was Private Lehmann, who walked with growing dread. The lieutenant had been explicit. If a Jew was found, he would be arrested immediately. Any French citizens aiding him would face severe punishment. Wagner had developed a reputation for making examples of those who defied German authority. David had been preparing for his departure, carefully packing the few belongings he would take. His medical textbook, a small photograph of his parents, a change of clothes, and a leather pouch containing his identification papers, both real and forged. The sound of German voices in the forest reached him seconds before the cabin was surrounded. There was nowhere to run. When the soldiers broke down the door, David offered no resistance. Lieutenant Wagner personally searched the cabin, his face lighting up with satisfaction when he discovered the forged papers and the small collection of resistance newspapers hidden beneath a floorboard. These would be more than enough to justify the harshest measures. David was bound and marched through the forest back toward the village. Private Lehman was assigned to guard duty, walking directly behind the prisoner. For 20 minutes, they moved in silence before Lehman, keeping his voice low, spoke. David's account, recorded years later, noted, "The young German soldier behind me whispered, 'I am sorry about the girl.' Those 6 words told me everything I needed to know. Marie was in danger, and it was because of me. I had believed our precautions sufficient, but in a village that small, with eyes everywhere, we had been foolish to think our meetings would remain secret forever." By the time they reached the village, Lieutenant Wagner had already dispatched soldiers to arrest Marie at the bakery. The entire village watched in shocked silence as she was dragged to the square, still wearing her flour-covered apron. Her mother collapsed in the street at the sight, supported by neighbors who had been friends since childhood. Simone, Marie's 14-year-old sister, tried to run to her but was held back by Monsieur Dupont, who understood all too well the danger of interfering. Colonel Muller arrived just as the public spectacle was being arranged. Lieutenant Wagner, eager to impress his superior, explained the situation with barely contained excitement. Here was an opportunity to make an example that would ensure compliance throughout the region. The colonel observed the proceedings with a detached professional interest, noting the gathering crowd of villagers. This would indeed send the necessary message. The German soldiers forced Marie to her knees in the center of the square. Lieutenant Wagner announced her crime to the assembled villagers, consorting with a Jew and aiding in subversive activities against the German Reich. The punishment would be carried out immediately. Corporal Schmidt produced a pair of scissors. Marie's golden hair, which had drawn admiring glances since her childhood, was roughly cut away, handfuls falling to the cobblestones around her knees. The villagers watched in horrified silence. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight of her humiliation. Others, like Jeanne Moreau, the informant, watched with complex emotions, satisfaction mingled with creeping shame. When the scissors had done their work, leaving Marie with jagged, uneven patches of hair no longer than a few centimeters, a straight razor was produced to complete the job. The June sun reflected off the blade as it removed the last traces of her golden crown. Tears streamed down Marie's face, but she made no sound. Throughout the ordeal, David was forced to watch, held between 2 German soldiers at the edge of the square. His face reflected an agony far beyond physical pain. In that moment, something shifted in Private Lehman, standing at attention nearby. The young soldier would later write in a letter home, which never passed the military censors. "I witnessed something today that I shall never forget, no matter how long I live. I saw cruelty masked as justice, hatred disguised as duty. They shaved a young woman's head because she loved someone they had decided was unworthy of love. In that moment, I understood that we have become the monsters in this war." After Marie's head had been completely shaved, her scalp nicked and bleeding in places from the razor's rough handling, Lieutenant Wagner ordered a sign hung around her neck. In both German and French, it read, "This is what happens to those who betray France with Jews." She was marched through every street of the village, displayed to her neighbors and friends as an object of shame and warning. David was loaded onto a transport truck with other prisoners from the region. As the truck pulled away, his eyes locked with Marie's across the square. Neither could speak, but in that moment of shared suffering, a promise passed between them, unspoken but no less powerful for its silence. Marie's mother and sister were allowed to take her home after the spectacle concluded. The family was now marked, their position in the community forever altered. That night, as Simone gently cleaned the cuts on her sister's scalp, Marie finally broke her silence. Simone would later recall, "She did not cry as I expected. Instead, she looked at me with such certainty and said, 'I would do it again. They can take my hair, they can take my standing in this village, but they cannot take away what I feel. And someday, this war will end.'" For David, the future held the grim prospect of deportation. The truck took him first to a holding facility in Lyon, where hundreds of other Jews awaited transport to camps in the east. His medical training temporarily saved him from immediate deportation. A German doctor, short-staffed and overwhelmed with cases of typhus among the prisoners, discovered David's background and requisitioned him as an assistant. In Saint-Étienne-du-Bois, life continued under the weight of occupation. Marie became a village pariah. Few dared to associate with her openly, fearing similar retribution. Her position at the bakery was terminated immediately. Even the church, which should have offered comfort, became uncomfortable territory, with the priest himself uncertain how to address her situation from the pulpit. Colonel Muller's report to his superiors in Paris noted the incident as a successful demonstration of authority that had resulted in improved compliance with requisition quotas in the region. The matter was considered resolved. Only Private Lehmann seemed disturbed by the events. In the weeks that followed, his commanding officers noted a change in his demeanor. Once an enthusiastic soldier, he became withdrawn, performing his duties adequately but without the conviction that had previously marked his service. When questioned by a superior, he claimed illness, a stomach complaint that would not quite resolve itself. By August 1943, 2 months after her public humiliation, Marie had adapted to her new reality. Her hair had begun to grow back, a short fuzz covering her previously bare scalp. She found work with a farmer on the outskirts of the village, where she would have minimal contact with others. The farmer, old Henri Bertrand, had lost his sons to the war, one killed at Dunkirk, the other a prisoner somewhere in Germany. He asked no questions and seemed indifferent to village gossip. David's situation had evolved in unexpected ways. His work in the prison infirmary had brought him to the attention of a German physician, Dr. Werner Müller, who recognized genuine talent. When orders came for the next transport east, Dr. Müller intervened, claiming David was essential to his ongoing work controlling the typhus outbreak. This temporary reprieve was the first stroke of fortune David had experienced since his capture. In October 1943, a resistance cell operating in Lyon executed an attack on a German officer's dining hall, killing 3 and wounding 11 others. The German response was immediate and severe. Hostages were taken throughout the region, and security at all detention facilities was enhanced. Dr. Müller could no longer justify keeping David from deportation. On October 12th, David was loaded onto a cattle car along with 80 other prisoners. As the train pulled away from Lyon, heading east toward an uncertain fate, David clutched his most precious possession, his medical textbook, with a small photograph of Marie hidden between its pages. A French railway worker, who had been bribed by the resistance, had managed to smuggle it to him the night before departure. In Saint-Étienne-du-Bois, autumn brought the grape harvest and increased German requisitions. The village's hostility toward Marie had gradually shifted to something more complex. As the occupation grew harsher, as more young men were taken for forced labor in Germany, and as rations grew even more meager, some began to see her punishment in a different light. There was a quiet admiration for someone who had defied the occupiers, regardless of the circumstances. Simone had joined a youth group that, unknown to most parents, was connected to the resistance. Her initial motivation had been to somehow avenge her sister's humiliation, but she quickly discovered a sense of purpose that transcended personal grievance. Through whispered conversations and coded messages, she learned that the resistance network extended even into the German military itself. There were soldiers who had grown disillusioned, who passed information or turned a blind eye at crucial moments. Private Ernst Lehmann was transferred out of Saint-Étienne-du-Bois in November, reassigned to a coastal defense unit in Normandy. Before leaving, he did something that could have cost him his life. He approached Monsieur Dupont at the bakery and left a sealed envelope to be delivered to Marie. The old baker, weighing the risks, kept the letter hidden for 3 weeks before finally passing it to Simone during a bread distribution. The letter, written in careful French that betrayed its German author, read simply, "The man you love was taken to Lyon but was working in the prison hospital when I left. He was alive and helping others. A good man should not be punished for being born as he was. Not all Germans believe what we are told to believe. Remember this when the war ends, as it must." Marie read the letter by candlelight, then burned it immediately as any communication from a German soldier could mark her for further punishment. But the knowledge that David had been alive, at least for a time, gave her the first hope she had felt in months. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was the harshest of the occupation. Fuel was scarce, food even scarcer. The resistance grew more active and German reprisals more severe. Marie's family survived largely thanks to old Henri Bertrand, who provided them with vegetables from his root cellar and occasional eggs or chicken when he could spare them. Marie's hair had grown back differently, darker, almost chestnut rather than the golden blonde it had been. Some in the village took this as a metaphorical darkening of her character, a physical manifestation of her fall from grace. Marie herself saw it differently. Like France itself, she had been transformed by suffering but not broken by it. In the spring of 1944, the village received news that would change everything. Allied forces were preparing for a major offensive. German troops began reinforcing coastal positions, and units stationed in small villages like Saint-Étienne-du-Bois were gradually reduced as soldiers were redeployed to more strategic locations. For David, the preceding months had been a desperate journey through the darkest aspects of the war. The train from Lyon had taken him not to the death camps of the East, but to a labor camp in Austria, where his medical knowledge again proved valuable. Working in brutal conditions, treating both prisoners and occasionally German personnel, he clung to survival one day at a time. A fellow prisoner, a French resistance fighter named Marcel Fournier, took an interest in the young medical student. Marcel had connections with partisan groups operating in the mountains and was planning an escape. He recognized in David not just a useful skill set, but a determined spirit that had somehow not been crushed by captivity. In late April 1944, Marcel's opportunity came. While on a work detail repairing a bridge damaged by Allied bombing, he and David, along with 3 others, managed to overpower their guards during an air raid and escape into the surrounding forest. 2 were shot during the attempt, but Marcel, David, and a Polish engineer named Wojtek reached the partisans' mountain hideout after 3 days of travel through difficult terrain. For the next 6 weeks, David worked with the partisan unit, treating wounded fighters and occasionally local civilians who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. His thoughts often returned to Marie, to the village of Saint-Étienne-du-Bois, and to the uncertain fate of his family. Had any of them survived? Would he ever have the chance to find out? The partisan commander, impressed with David's commitment and abilities, made contact with Allied forces advancing through Italy. Arrangements were made to extract individuals with valuable skills who might assist in the coming invasion of France. In early June, David and 2 others were transported by a series of guides and safe houses to the coast, where a British submarine collected them during a moonless night. Lieutenant David Rosenberg, granted a field commission in recognition of his medical skills, landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 12, 1944, 6 days after the initial invasion. Assigned to a medical unit supporting the American 4th Infantry Division, he found himself moving through France with the Allied advance, gradually pushing inland toward Paris and beyond. In Saint-Étienne-du-Bois, the reduction in German presence had emboldened the local resistance. Simone, now 16, had become a full-fledged member, serving as a courier between cells. Marie worried constantly for her sister's safety, but understood the need to fight back in whatever way possible. The village held its breath, caught between hope for liberation and fear of final German reprisals. News of the Normandy landings had reached them through BBC broadcasts, and whispered updates passed from farm to farm. Freedom seemed possible for the first time in years, yet still agonizingly distant. Marie continued her work at Henri Bertrand's farm, now additionally supplying food to resistance fighters hiding in the surrounding forests. Her knowledge of the terrain, gained during her months of secret meetings with David, proved invaluable. The village girl who had been publicly shamed now moved through the night with quiet confidence, guiding others along hidden paths and warning of German patrols. As summer progressed, the sound of distant artillery became occasionally audible from the west. German units began withdrawing from the region, often requisitioning vehicles and livestock for their retreat. The remaining occupation forces grew increasingly nervous, their previous arrogance replaced by the grim awareness of approaching retribution. Lieutenant Wagner, who had orchestrated Marie's humiliation, departed with the main German contingent in late July, but not before ordering the execution of 3 suspected resistance members in a final display of power. Among the witnesses to this last atrocity was Jeanne Moreau, the informant whose report had led to Marie's punishment. Something broke in Jeanne that day, some final self-deception about the nature of the regime she had accommodated. That night, Jeanne appeared at the Beaumont family's door, pale and trembling. Marie's mother initially refused to let her enter, but Marie herself, seeing something changed in the woman's demeanor, invited her inside. There, in the small kitchen where the family had endured countless hungry nights, Jeanne confessed her role in the events of the previous year. Marie's response, recalled years later by her sister, demonstrated the profound transformation she had undergone. My sister looked at this woman, this neighbor who had betrayed her, and said simply, "I already knew. I have known since the beginning, and I have had a year to decide whether to hate you. I choose not to. Hatred is what they brought to our village. I will not let it remain when they are gone." The first Allied soldiers reached Saint-Étienne-du-Bois in the early morning of September 3rd, 1944. American jeeps and half-tracks rumbled down the main street, greeted by villagers who had emerged cautiously at first, then with growing celebration. Children who had never seen chocolate received their first taste from smiling GIs. Women brought out hoarded bottles of wine that had been hidden in cellars and behind false walls for years, saving them for precisely this moment of liberation. Marie watched the arrival from the edge of the crowd, her hair now grown to just below her ears, her face thinner but her eyes brighter than they had been since before her ordeal. She felt a strange mixture of emotions, joy at the liberation, lingering shame at how some still viewed her, and beneath it all, a quiet ache for the man she had lost. In the year since her punishment, she had received no further word of David beyond the German private's letter. She had forced herself to accept the probability that he, like so many others, had perished in the camps. Captain James Williams of the United States Army's 358th Medical Battalion surveyed the village with professional interest. His unit would establish a temporary aid station here to treat both military casualties and civilian medical emergencies. The advance had been swift in recent weeks, leaving behind many localities where basic medical care had been non-existent during the occupation. Williams called over one of his officers, a recent addition to the unit who had proven exceptionally valuable despite his unconventional background. "Lieutenant Rosenberg, find us a suitable building for the aid station, something central with good access for ambulances. And see if there's someone in charge of this place we should talk to." Lieutenant David Rosenberg, now wearing an American uniform with medical insignia, looked out at the village square, the same square where 15 months earlier he had been forced to watch Marie's humiliation. The memory had haunted him through his imprisonment, escape, and service with the Allies. He had deliberately requested assignment to this region, hoping against reason that his path might someday lead back to Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. Now, standing in the square as a liberator rather than a prisoner, the reality seemed almost too incredible to comprehend. Captain Williams noticed his lieutenant's distraction. "Problem, Rosenberg." David collected himself. "No, sir, I know this place. Before the war." Williams raised an eyebrow. Many of the European refugees who had joined their ranks had similar moments as the Allied advance reclaimed territories filled with personal history. "Well, that should make finding what we need easier. Carry on, Lieutenant." David moved through the celebrating crowd, searching faces. Most were unfamiliar, villagers who had arrived after his time hiding in the forest, or those he had never met during his secret meetings with Marie. A few seemed vaguely familiar, but none recognized the Jewish medical student in the American officer before them. His appearance had changed considerably. He was now leaner, more weathered, with a military bearing that transformed his once scholarly demeanor. At the village hall he found the newly established civilian administration. The mayor, an elderly man named François Clément, who had maintained a careful neutrality during the occupation, greeted the American officer with a mixture of deference and pride. David, speaking French with the same Lyonnais accent that had marked him as an outsider years before, inquired about suitable buildings for a medical station. The mayor suggested the schoolhouse, which had ample space and had been used periodically by German medical officers during the occupation. "And the bakery?" David asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Monsieur Dupont's place. Is it still operating?" The mayor nodded. "Yes, though Monsieur Dupont is not well. His nephew runs it now. They managed to keep baking through the worst of the occupation, though there was little enough flour to work with. David hesitated, then asked the question that had burned within him for 15 months. There was a young woman who worked there, Marie Beaumont. Do you know what became of her? The mayor's expression shifted subtly, a mixture of discomfort and something like respect crossing his weathered features. The Beaumont girl. She works at old Henri Bertrand's farm on the north edge of the village. There was an incident during the occupation. She has kept to herself since then. David thanked the mayor and completed his inspection of the schoolhouse, making notes on supplies that would be needed. He reported back to Captain Williams, who agreed with the location and ordered the medical company to begin setting up. Throughout these procedures, performed with the efficiency he had developed during months of service, David's mind was elsewhere, on a farm at the northern edge of the village. Marie worked in Henri Bertrand's vegetable garden, harvesting the late summer beans that would sustain the farm through the coming winter. She had heard the commotion from the village, but had chosen to continue her work. The celebrations would go on without her. Though her position in the community had slowly evolved from outcast to a kind of reluctant respect for her resistance work, she still felt separate from the collective joy of liberation. Her war had been different, more personal, marked by a loss that liberation could not restore. Henri, who had become something of a father figure to her, emerged from the farmhouse. "You should go to the village. See the Americans," he urged. "Everyone is there." Marie shook her head. "The beans won't harvest themselves, and there will be Americans in the village tomorrow and the day after. I can meet them then." The old farmer studied her for a moment. "Your sister came by. She said to tell you there's a medical unit setting up in the schoolhouse. They need volunteers with any nursing experience. She thought you might help, given what you learned caring for your friend." Marie straightened, brushing soil from her hands. During the months she had cared for David in the hunting cabin, he had taught her basic medical techniques from his textbook: how to check for fever, clean wounds, apply proper bandages. She had used these skills later with the resistance. Perhaps this was a way she could contribute meaningfully to the liberation, beyond simply celebrating its arrival. David spent the afternoon establishing the aid station with mechanical efficiency, his mind divided between his duties and the knowledge that Marie was somewhere nearby. He organized supplies, assigned personnel to various stations, and coordinated with the civil authorities for potential civilian cases, all while fighting the urge to abandon his post and search for her immediately. By 1600 hours, the station was operational. Captain Williams, noticing his lieutenant's continued distraction, said, "Rosenberg, you've been going since dawn. Take a couple of hours. Familiarize yourself with the village if you know it. Might be useful to have someone who can navigate locally." David didn't need to be told twice. He saluted, stepped out of the schoolhouse, and began walking toward the northern edge of the village. The path was familiar, even after all this time, the same route that led toward the forest where his hunting cabin hideout had been. Henri Bertrand's farm lay in the same direction, just before the tree line. As he walked, villagers nodded respectfully at his uniform. A few children followed him for a while, hoping for chocolate or chewing gum like the other American soldiers had distributed. David smiled and gave them what he had in his pockets, watching as they ran off satisfied with their treasures. The Bertrand farm came into view, a modest stone house with outbuildings, a vegetable garden and a small orchard. Chickens pecked in the yard and smoke rose from the chimney. David paused at the edge of the property, suddenly uncertain. What if Marie had changed her feelings? What if the trauma of her punishment had turned her bitter toward the very cause of her suffering? What if she had found someone else? Before he could resolve these questions, a figure emerged from behind the house, carrying a basket of vegetables. Even at a distance, even with her hair so much shorter and darker than before, he recognized her immediately. His heart seemed to stop, then race forward at double speed. Marie, focused on her task, did not notice the American officer standing at the edge of the property until she was halfway to the house. When she looked up and saw the uniform, she prepared the same polite greeting she would offer any of the liberators. Then she saw his face. The basket fell from her hands, vegetables tumbling across the ground. She stood frozen, unable to believe who she was seeing. David took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with growing certainty. Marie's diary, kept faithfully since the day of her punishment, recorded September 3rd. How does one describe a miracle? Words seem altogether inadequate. He walked out of my memories and into Henri's farmyard, as though crossing that distance was no more remarkable than crossing a street. David, alive in an American uniform, somehow both exactly as I remembered and entirely transformed. When our eyes met, the 15 months between us collapsed to nothing. In that moment, I understood that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance or even by war itself. They met in the middle of the farmyard, neither speaking at first. David reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing her cheek as if to confirm she was real. Marie leaned into his touch, tears filling her eyes. "Your hair," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Marie gave a small, sad smile. "It grew back. Different, but it grew back. I saw. That day in the square. They made me watch." His voice broke slightly on the words. "I know. I saw you too. It was the only thing that gave me strength, knowing you could see that I didn't break, that I didn't renounce you." Old Henri Bertrand observed the reunion from the doorway of his farmhouse, understanding immediately what he was witnessing. He quietly retreated inside, giving them privacy for this moment that belonged only to them. David explained his journey, the labor camp, the escape, his work with the partisans, and finally his commission with the American Medical Corps. Marie told him of her gradual involvement with the resistance, of Simone's courier work, of the slow shift in the village's perception as more people found themselves aligned against the occupiers. "And Jeanne Moreau? The woman who reported us?" David asked. Marie's expression grew complicated. "She confessed to me, just before the Germans withdrew. She's been trying to atone in her way, helping the resistance with information, sharing her extra rations with families in need." David absorbed this, his medical training having taught him much about the complexity of human behavior under extreme circumstances. "And have you forgiven her?" Marie considered the question. "I'm trying. Some days are easier than others, but hatred exhausts me more than forgiveness does." They walked together back toward the village, Marie having decided to volunteer at the aid station after all. As they approached, villagers stopped and stared. The significance of the scene was immediately apparent to those who remembered the events of June 7th, 1943. Marie Beaumont, whose head had been shaved for loving a Jew, was walking proudly beside an Allied officer who looked at her with undisguised adoration. Simone spotted them from across the square and ran to embrace her sister and the man she had never expected to see again. Through her tears, she managed to say, I knew it. Somehow I knew you would come back." Word spread quickly through Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. By evening, the story of the reunion was being told and retold, growing more romantic with each iteration. Some claimed they had always supported Marie, conveniently forgetting their earlier condemnation. Others, more honest, acknowledged the lesson in what they were witnessing, that the judgments of the occupation had been reversed, that what had been deemed shameful was now revealed as courageous. Sergeant Michael Collins, a medic under Captain Williams's command, observed the effect Lieutenant Rosenberg's presence had on the village with curiosity. He had worked alongside the lieutenant since his assignment to their unit 3 months earlier, but knew little of his background, beyond the fact that he had escaped from a labor camp and had formal medical training. Now, watching the reaction of the villagers, he realized there was much more to the story. "The lieutenant seems to know this place well," Collins remarked to Captain Williams as they supervised the evening's medical intake. Williams nodded. "Apparently he has history here. Something personal, I gather." Collins watched as Rosenberg efficiently instructed Marie and 2 other local volunteers on proper bandaging techniques. "The locals are looking at him like he's something between a ghost and a celebrity. War creates strange stories, Collins. If we survive this thing, we'll all have tales that sound unbelievable to anyone who wasn't there." The medical station treated 16 patients that first evening, 3 American soldiers with minor injuries, 2 elderly villagers with conditions exacerbated by years of malnutrition, and 11 children suffering various ailments that had gone untreated during the occupation. David worked tirelessly, his medical knowledge complemented by Marie's assistance and her ability to translate local dialects that gave some of the American medics difficulty. As the aid station quieted for the night, Captain Williams approached David. "You and your friend have been invaluable today. Lieutenant, where did she get her medical training?" David exchanged a glance with Marie before answering. "I taught her, sir, when I was hiding here before my capture." Williams raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "Well, if she's willing, we could use her help while we're stationed here. We'll be moving on soon enough. The front keeps advancing, but there's plenty to do in the meantime." The following days established a routine. The American Medical Unit treated both military personnel and villagers in need, while beginning to train local volunteers who would maintain basic care after their departure. David and Marie worked side by side, their professional partnership deepening the renewed personal connection between them. Jeanne Moreau came to the aid station on the third day, ostensibly seeking treatment for a persistent cough. When she saw David, she froze, recognition and shame washing over her features. He recognized her immediately as the woman who had watched so intently during Marie's punishment. Marie, noticing the encounter, came to stand beside David. "Madame Moreau needs examination for a respiratory condition," she said formally. David hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, please come this way, madame." As he conducted the examination, Jeanne finally spoke in a low, strained voice. "You must hate me, I reported you both." David continued his work, listening to her breathing with a stethoscope. Finally he responded, "Hatred has no place in medicine, madame. We treat everyone, regardless of their past actions." After a pause, he added, "Marie has told me of your recent efforts to help. That counts for something." The encounter, witnessed by several villagers who had come for treatment, became another chapter in the unfolding story that was captivating Saint-Étienne-du-Bois. The Jewish doctor, now returned as an American officer, showing compassion to the very woman who had caused both his capture and Marie's humiliation. It seemed a parable for the kind of healing the entire nation needed. On September 7th, 4 days after the liberation of the village, the Allied command ordered Captain Williams' unit to move forward with the advance. They would depart the following morning, continuing eastward toward the German border. The news sent a pang of anxiety through both David and Marie. Their reunion, so miraculous and unexpected, would be cut short by the continuing demands of war. That evening, as the aid station was being packed up, David sought out Captain Williams. "Sir, request permission to speak with you privately." Williams, reviewing supply manifests, looked up with mild surprise. "Of course, Lieutenant. What's on your mind?" David straightened to his full height, gathering his resolve. "Sir, I wish to request that Marie Beaumont be permitted to accompany our unit as a civilian medical assistant. Her skills have proven valuable, and she has expressed willingness to continue serving." William studied his lieutenant carefully. "This is about more than medical assistance, isn't it, Rosenberg?" "Yes, sir. Marie and we have a history. She suffered greatly for helping me during the occupation. I don't want to leave her behind again." The captain sighed. "Hey, you know that's not standard procedure. We're a military unit heading toward active combat zones, not a refugee transport." "I understand, sir, but these are not standard times. Marie has worked with the resistance. She has medical training. She speaks both French and German, which could be invaluable as we move toward the border. And—" David hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity, "And I owe her my life, sir." Williams was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I'll need to clear it with command. No promises, and she'll need to understand the risks she's taking. Combat medical units aren't safe positions, Lieutenant. She understands risk better than most, sir. The occupation taught her that." That night, under a clear September sky filled with stars, David and Marie sat on a bench outside the schoolhouse that had served as their medical station. The village was quiet, most residents having retired early, exhausted by the excitement of liberation and the emotional extremes of the past days. "You're sure about this?" David asked, holding her hand in his. "Following a medical unit isn't safe. We'll be moving toward Germany, toward the fighting." Marie's expression was resolute. I've spent over a year wondering if you were dead or alive, David. Now that I've found you again, now that you found me, I won't be separated by this war a second time. The village is your home. Your mother, Simone, they're here. Simone understands. She's seen enough of war to recognize what matters. As for my mother..." Marie smiled slightly. "She told me that if I let you leave without me, she would never forgive me. She said she didn't endure the past year, watching me rebuild myself, just to see me make the mistake of letting love slip away twice." David was quiet for a moment, looking out over the village square where Marie had suffered her greatest humiliation. "When they shaved your head, when they marched you through the streets with that sign around your neck, I made a promise to myself. I promised that if I survived, if I ever had the chance, I would find a way back to you. I would show everyone that what they meant as shame was actually a badge of honor." Marie leaned her head against his shoulder. "And here you are in an American uniform, the liberation personified." "Not just me," David corrected gently. "Us. You remained when I couldn't. You endured what I was powerless to prevent. Your courage humbles me, Marie." In the quiet that followed, they both reflected on the improbable path that had led to this moment, from a chance meeting in a forest to public humiliation to unexpected reunion. The war had taken so much from so many, yet somehow, against overwhelming odds, it had given them this second chance. Morning brought confirmation that Marie would be permitted to accompany the medical unit as a civilian assistant. Captain Williams, having received authorization from his superiors who were desperate for qualified medical personnel as casualties mounted, delivered the news himself. "You'll be officially listed as a French civilian liaison," he explained. "We can't offer you a proper salary, but you'll receive rations and quarters with the unit, and I'll expect you to follow orders like anyone else under my command." Marie nodded solemnly. "I understand, Captain. Thank you for this opportunity." The village gathered to watch the departure of the American unit. Military vehicles lined the main street, loaded with supplies and personnel. Marie said her goodbyes to her family, her mother holding her tightly, Simone promising to look after things in her absence, old Henri Bertrand pressing a small package of food into her hands for the journey. As Marie prepared to board the medical transport where David waited, a figure pushed through the crowd. Jeanne Moreau approached, her expression a mixture of shame and determination. In her hands she held a small wooden box. "Marie," she said quietly, "before you go, I wanted to give you this." She held out the box. "It's not much, but..." Marie opened it to find a silver locket on a chain. Inside was a small photograph, Marie's parents on their wedding day. Her father in his World War I uniform, her mother young and smiling beside him. "I took it from your house," Jeanne confessed. "The day after what happened in the square, the Germans were searching homes of collaborators, looking for valuables to confiscate. I told them I had already searched your home and found nothing. I've kept it safe, waiting for the right time to return it." Marie stared at the locket, then at the woman who had both betrayed and in this small way protected her family. Without speaking, she embraced Jeanne briefly, the gesture witnessed by the assembled villagers. It was not complete forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement of the complexity of human actions during impossible times. From the transport, David watched the exchange with a mixture of emotions. The village that had been the site of his greatest suffering was also the place where he had found love that transcended the hatred surrounding them. As Marie climbed aboard and took her place beside him, he felt a sense of completion, a circle closing. The convoy moved out, the vehicles proceeding slowly through streets lined with villagers waving French flags and American ones hastily created from whatever materials could be found. Marie and David looked back at Saint-Étienne-du-Bois, knowing that regardless of where the war took them next, they would someday return, not as fugitive and protector, not as prisoner and outcast, but as testament to what could endure even through the darkest of times. In the months that followed, their journey would take them through eastern France and eventually into Germany itself as the Allied advance pushed toward final victory. They would treat hundreds of wounded, American, French, German, civilian and military alike. They would witness the liberation of other villages, each with its own stories of occupation and resistance. Through it all, their partnership deepened, their shared experiences creating a bond that few could understand. Captain Williams, observing their work, noted in his official report, "The addition of civilian assistant M. Beaumont has proven invaluable to unit operations. Her knowledge of local conditions and languages has facilitated treatment across diverse populations. Her partnership with Lieutenant Rosenberg demonstrates the kind of cooperation between Allied forces and local populations that will be essential to rebuilding Europe after victory is achieved." In April 1945, as the war in Europe neared its conclusion, David received word that his parents had survived. They had successfully reached Switzerland in 1943 and had been living in Geneva throughout the remainder of the war. The news completed a circle of hope that had begun with his reunion with Marie. They married in June 1945, 1 month after victory in Europe Day, in a small ceremony at an American field hospital near Munich. Captain Williams served as best man. Sergeant Collins played wedding music on a salvaged piano. The bride wore a simple white dress sewn by nurses from parachute silk, and her hair, grown out now to shoulder length, was adorned with wild flowers gathered by local children who had come to know the kind French woman who helped the American doctors. In his wedding vows, David spoke words that many present would never forget. "When they shaved your head to shame you for loving me, they unwittingly revealed the most beautiful truth, that love cannot be diminished by cruelty. It only shines more brightly against the darkness. What they meant as punishment became proof of your courage. What they intended as division became our strongest bond." After the war, David and Marie returned to Saint-Étienne-du-Bois, where David established a medical practice serving the village and surrounding communities. The hunting cabin where they had first found each other was rebuilt and preserved as a private retreat, a reminder of where their journey had begun. Marie's hair grew long again over the years, though it never returned to its original golden color. The chestnut shade became her trademark in the village, a visible reminder of transformation and resilience. Some of the older villagers still remembered the day of her humiliation, but those memories were now overshadowed by decades of her service to the community alongside her husband. Their story became part of the village's history, told and retold to new generations, not as a tale of shame, but as an example of how love could persevere even through humanity's darkest chapter. The square where Marie had been shamed eventually became the site of a small memorial to all those from Saint-Étienne-du-Bois who had resisted occupation in ways both large and small. David's medical textbook, carried with him through imprisonment, escape, and war, occupied a place of honor in their home. Between its pages, preserved carefully, was the photograph of Marie that had sustained him during their separation, a tangible reminder that even in the most hopeless circumstances, love could endure. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, an elderly David and Marie attended the dedication of a new wing at the regional hospital. Named in their honor, it stood as testament to 4 decades of medical service to a region that had once been torn apart by conflict, but had been slowly, painstakingly healed through the efforts of countless individuals who chose reconciliation over continued hatred. As they stood together at the ceremony, Marie, her hair now silver but still thick and vibrant, leaned close to her husband and whispered, "Who would have thought all those years ago in that hunting cabin that this would be our legacy?" David smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with remembered joy and pain. "I think perhaps you did," he replied. "Even then, when everything seemed impossible, you saw possibility. You always had the greater courage." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.